the record button, so we are officially recording, everyone. And it's hey Brendan. Unless you have a question, maybe just put off your video so you can kind of focus on Al, and I'll let you maybe introduce yourself, Al, and say a couple words before we start.
Sure. Civilisation, Londa Hawit Young Jats, Nawal in Market Loda, Oneida, Wanga Joda. Also known as Al Day, as Sarah's mentioned, have some current responsibilities within my nation, and also the executive director, and so I've done a fair number of things over time, and so I'm pleased to be here, and I'll do my best to answer some questions. That's the way we set it up, rather than me babbling away on things that maybe you're not interested. Hopefully we'll keep your interest, and she's going to ask you some questions, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, and don't hesitate if you have questions as Al is speaking, to throw them in the chat, and we will tackle them as they come up. Yeah, so I mean, even in the introduction that I just used, and as part of Western's land acknowledgement, we do often refer to the dish with one spoon wampum. So I was just wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit about dish with one spoon and how it's still taken up today.
Okay, thank you. Well, the I would like to speak about at some point about London Township Treaty and other things. What predates those treaties, as well as the 1701 treaty, which I'll talk about, is the dish with one spoon. And the dish with one spoon was made amongst different indigenous nations prior to the arrival of the colonists. And it principally was intended to be one where the indigenous perspective on Mother Earth was that we shared, and to share the land, we took what we needed and we didn't overtake anything. But we also, within that dish of the spoon, we respected the primacy of the individual or respective nation that we were involved with. And so, well, my first learning about this was I understood that the dish of one spoon was principally between the Haudenosaunee and the Council of Three Fires. Subsequent to that, I found out that the dish of one spoon was made with Algonquins. There also was a Sioux the dish of one spoon treaty. It was with one of their neighbors. I forget who it was. So the idea again was that you took what you needed. It was an understanding that you would share in the resources that Mother Earth provided, and it was never intended to be a signal or a representation of ownership. It's interesting that ownership, the connotation, of land acknowledgement, seems to me it's gotten its legs from when the Truth and Reconciliation report was first handed out. And there was a lot of recommendations, as we know, and most are still not being implemented. That's another story. But so what arose from that was there started to be land acknowledgements. I remember speaking in a large group, 300-400 people a couple of years ago, and then last year as well. I was asked to speak and talk about land acknowledgement, and so I said, well, I'm prepared to do a land acknowledgement, but not in the context of what you understand. And so what I talked about that night was land acknowledgement connotates pre-ownership of land, and that's not what land acknowledgement is about. And the Haudenosaunee or Oneida or Oneida way of before we meet. When we have meetings or we do a ceremony, we have what we call an opening, words that come before all else. And what we do is the person that's doing the opening goes through a process of giving thanks to all things in creation. And I've sat through 2 sessions where it took an hour of presentation before we actually started the meeting. One time was a meeting, another time was a ceremony. So it depends on the speaker. It depends on, I guess, their level of awareness on our ways, but also maybe in respect to what the meeting's about. Normally it takes 15, 20 minutes. And so at Narrabeen, we have a couple of pipe carriers, Ojibwe pipe carriers. So I asked, I said, so you know about the opening in our ways. I said, what's similar in Ojibwe? And they said, well, what's similar is a couple of things. One is the sunrise ceremony, the other is a pipe ceremony. So I said, oh, so when you're doing a pipe ceremony and you're speaking a language, you're turning to the four directions, you're actually giving thanks to all things in creation and to the spirits. And they said, yeah. So I was not aware of that. But so it's not about the fact is that all Indigenous nations pre-arrival had ways and still do that of opening and giving thanks to creation. So that is definitely, it's part of the dish with one spoon. And I was talking to a friend of mine, one of our chiefs, who's much more knowledgeable than me, and we were talking about dish with one spoon. And when did that first happen? Like, when were their first agreements? Well, certainly pre-contact, and there have been some subsequent times when the arrangements have been made between nations, Indigenous nations. But he was telling me that it's found within our creation story, and it also is found within the Great Law, where it's understood that you're to share. It's meant to be that you don't take more than what you need, and that there's got to be respect for other Indigenous nations. So that's the basics of Dish with One Spoon. More recently, the Chippewa Thames community, the Ojibwe community, they had a May Day ceremony be about 6 years ago now, in their community, and they were telling us they think that was the first time in about 170 years that they actually had that May Day ceremony. So there was a formal invitation extended to us in our longhouse, and so what happens is that the individual brings a wampum, if you will. It's a wampum stick with it's a stick with a wampum on the end, and in the language he explains why he's there, and the purpose for that day was that he was inviting us to participate in the ceremony. And so when we hear the message, then we have a discussion, and if we send a runner across the longhouse to pick up the wampum, that means we're accepting the invitation. So we participated, and we danced and sang our way across the bridge that joins the two communities, and even though the invitation was extended and they knew we were coming, once we got to the lodge, the May Day Lodge, there was a formal introduction, and then they had to decide whether in fact they were going to invite us in. So that took about 45 minutes. And so once we were invited in, then we went and danced counterclockwise, or clockwise as opposed to our ways as counterclockwise, and then we were seated, and we actually we repeated the dish with the one spoon ceremony. And prior to that, we exchanged gifts as a formal greeting of each other, and we again we had dish with one spoon reenactment, if you will. So it was a good thing.
Incredible, because like with things like dish with one spoon, like that whole idea of like polishing the belt, like it would be like a ceremony kind of every year or like a renewal, right? So it's awesome to see that happened.
Yeah, and when the various dish with one spoon agreements were made between respective confederacies and nations, the understanding was that they were going to be renewed on an annual basis or on a fairly regular basis, and with the encroachment upon our respective territories and our way of life, it doesn't happen as frequently as it should, and that's something that I think we should be getting back to.
Definitely. So you did mention that you wanted to speak to some of the local treaties as well, like the London Township Treaty and those kinds of things. And I know Oneida has a really unique history as to how the settlement came to be there. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to those things.
Sure. Well, it was several years ago. The elected chief at the time at Chippewa Thames had visited City Council and presented them a 2-row wampum. and suggested that somehow it belonged to them, and they were bringing good words and greetings, and which was a good thing. And they also there was reference made to the London Township Treaty, and so I was curious about that, and I think it was in the late 1796 or something like that. The treaty was made. And I guess it just goes to show you how the Crown picks and chooses which treaties they'll deal with, or which ones they'll recognize, or which is convenient for them. So in 1701, the Haudenosaunee had to enter into a treaty arrangement with the Crown officials in Albany, New York. And that was previous to the American Revolution. So the British at that point were very much in control of what's now the United States, and there was ongoing disputes with the French with respect to what's now Canada. So what they did was they put the title of land in trust with the Crown, and it depends on who you talk to and what that area covers, but somewhere 400 miles wide by 800 miles long. So somewhere in an area of somewhere east of Oshawa up to all of Manitoulin Island, Sault Ste. Marie, all of the state of Michigan, into Chicago, into Illinois, Ohio, and up through Pennsylvania, and up through New York State, and somewhere on the other side of Lake Ontario. And what they said was that they had put the title of land in trust to the Crown. And we also, and the Crown is supposed to protect our title, and at the same time we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather. Well, there's two parts to that. One is that when we had first contact, all Indigenous people had first contact with the colonists or the Europeans, we didn't know what it meant to own Mother Earth. How can you own your mother? How can you own something or a creature, in this way, a creature in the sense that such Mother Earth is? How can you own somebody that provides for you? How can you own that something that gives, doesn't necessarily give physical birth to you, but it actually supports your life? And so we had, that was one of the things we had to learn to adjust. So by that time, by 1701, we realized that these folks that were newcomers to our land, they had been in there for a couple of centuries over here. They were very desirous of something called title of land. So we started having to use that language, and that connotation was. So when I was thinking about the 1701, and I was thinking about relative treaties and treaty settlements that have been made by respective communities in Southern Ontario, I thought about that, and I thought, what about 1701? And then I got reminded that the One Spoon precedes any of those treaties. And in fact, what we should be doing is we should be supportive of our brother nations, sister nations, when reaching some settlement with the Crown. And it also respects the fact that they have an entitlement to land just as much as we do. And what we should be looking at is not exclusive. It's not an exclusive entitlement, but it's a shared entitlement. So the London Township Treaty and the Sombra treaties. Those to me represent what's a nice way of describing this? The current federal government position. Well, actually, even before the current federal government, the Crown position. What would satisfy the desire to acquire land? So they went around and they entered into various treaties. And I would encourage your students, if they haven't done it, they should do some research on a doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery is really it was formulated principally by King Henry VIII, and he's government, and essentially it said very simply that they might be people living in North America, but they were heathen savages. They didn't have the capacity to hold land, and all we had to do was plant the British flag and the land, and it became instantly British land. And so that was the what our people didn't understand was that was the kind of agreements we were entering into agreements with thieves and liars. And so I guess it also speaks to the issue of why I was having lunch with a friend of mine a few years ago. He's a historian and knows Colonel Talbot, a lot of those folks very well. And he said to me, Al, he said, I don't understand why you guys don't enter into negotiations. Why don't you enter into dialogue with the Crown. And I looked at him and I said, you tell me one time you guys have lived up to your word, you lived up to the terms of the treaty. So he raised his hand, he had his finger up, and he was going to make a point, and he realized, he said, yeah, you're right. So that's my point, is those agreements, the London Township Treaty is an example, is self-serving. It was self-serving to the Crown. And so, unfortunately, it seems that too many of our people have bought into the way the Crown interprets things. And certainly we've evolved into, unfortunately, material wealth seems to be it seems to have a lot of influence in our thinking. And so with the imposition of band councils in our respective communities, it's led us further down that trail in terms of assimilation, colonialism, and actually what the Doctrine of Discovery is all about. So I'll stop there.
I have a couple of things that I'm thinking maybe some folks that are listening. You did mention the two-row wampum, and I thought it was really interesting that you said someone from Chief of Chippewa brought it to the City Council at London. Can you tell a little bit more about the two-row wampum and about that situation?
Sure. In the language, it's called Digna Yohade. And it was first entered into the Dutch in 1613, and subsequently it was entered into the British in 1664. And essentially, it's really simple in concept. It takes a little longer to explain it, but the concept is we're going down this river of life together. The respective nations are going down this river of life together, and we're going to stay in our small canoe, and they're going to stay in their large ship. And we're going to go along this journey of life together, and we're going to go side by side, but we're not going to interfere with each other. We're not going to tell each other what to do. We're not going to pass laws and legislation that will tell each other what to do. They're going to respect our way of life. They're going to respect our belief systems, including our relation to the natural world, and likewise, we're not going to influence them. So that's the basis of the two-row. And so when there was a press report about the community, our neighbor community, coming and doing a presentation to the City Council, I called a friend of mine who's very knowledgeable about these things, done a lot of research, and I said, tell me something, I'm curious, does the Ojibwe Nation have two-row? And he kind of chuckles and he says, well, they have something kind of similar in nature that was made in Ottawa. And I said, oh yeah. I said, but they don't have one. And he said, no, they don't. So the former mayor of London, I happened to have a chance to talk to him recently, and I said, do you know, when you were presented the two-row several years ago, I said, you know, that didn't belong to the community. He chuckled and he said, yeah. He said, subsequent to that, I did find out some information. So I don't want to be disrespectful to our neighbors, and I think they were, trying to put their best foot forward to try and achieve some level of acknowledgement, recognition by the City Council, which is fine. But the but is the two-row was again first made with the Dutch in 1613. Following the two-row, there was a silver covenant chain that was established as well, and what our people found was that the two-row talked about separation and respect for each other, and what they realized is what needed to happen was that they had to establish what did that silver covenant chain mean, or what did the two-row mean in terms of relationships. So they established something called, it was first of all called an iron chain, and then it eventually morphed into something called a silver covenant chain. And that was to bind our friendship. It was to represent the peace, and the other thing was it was supposed to be internal friendship. More recently, we hosted the Dutch embassy officials at our longhouse in 2010. It was October 15th. I was just reading. The reason why the date stuck in my mind, I was reading some material last night in preparation for this. So we hosted a meeting with the Dutch embassy officials, and I think everybody in the Dutch embassy, except the ambassador himself was at our longhouse. And so it was a very formal meeting. It was a diplomatic meeting. We did the opening, and there was an exchange of greetings, or an exchange of gifts. And what they wanted was to hear from one of our elders do the explanation. So first of all, he presented the Turo in a language, and he translated. And so it was accepted. And then we had a question for the Dutch embassy. We said, your country used to recognize Haudenosaunee passports. How come you don't anymore? And so we explained some thoughts around that. And so they said, we'll take it back and we'll check it out. So about 14 months later, the Dutch government got a hold of us and said that they recognize our passports. So we're able to travel to up to 45 countries in the world have accepted our passports over time. And that varies depending on who's in place. But currently, Dutch recognize our passports, and so do the Swiss. And it varies by country. We were actually at a meeting with the Irish embassy officials this past February, and what we're doing was we're making arrangements to have our lacrosse national team go to participate. And of course, with the COVID situation, that didn't happen. But we were in preparation for is to ensure that the Irish government was going to accept our passports. And it's interesting, as many countries in the world recognize our passports, the two most difficult countries we have is Canada and the United States. So I think maybe that's one reason for that. It's probably the basis, the doctrine of discovery. They would just soon see us disappear, all of us.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago, the lacrosse team being blocked from entering, I want to say Brazil. I feel like, I don't know which country, but because
England.
England, okay. They were using Haudenosaunee Confederacy passports. And that kind of that does tie into treaty, because that's like Haudenosaunee Confederacy, through Section 35 of the Constitution, just like other Indigenous nations, that right to define nationhood and that sovereignty is encoded in that. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about those passports and how that.
Sure. Well, as a matter of fact, the Iroquois nationals, they did travel to Israel and participate in the World Championships. They traveled on our passports several years ago. In fact, the Onondaga community south of Syracuse hosted the World Championships about 6 years ago. And all the countries in the world the ones that participate in lacrosse national championships, world championship, participated. So part of the process that was put in place was we had it set up that every team that came in had to have their passports stamped by the Onondaga Nation, as a sign of acceptance that they're okay to come in. Canada told their team, if you get your passports stamped, we're going home. So they said, okay, well, we want to expect them to have their passports presented to us. But at the same time, Canada also told their team, you cannot participate in any community activities whatsoever. If you participate, we're going home. So it's pretty instructive of how when you sort of scratch the surface, you start getting underneath it. How Canada really is very, very, very domineering, patriarchal. So our passports. In 1924, one of the Cayuga chiefs, his name was Deskai, he went, the League of Nations had been recently formed after World War I, and they were meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. And so Indigenous people were getting treated badly in Canada, and particularly the Haudenosaunee people. So Deskai, he travels to Switzerland on his own volition, on his own information, no Canadian passports. He's accepted in the country, and what he's not allowed to do is enter into the League of Nations. He's not allowed to address them. They won't let him speak. But the mayor of Geneva befriended him, and so what he did was the mayor made arrangements for Deskai to go speak to a number of delegations and that represent different nations in the world. And he made the point. So following that session was over, Discahe went to come back to Canada, and Canada would not allow him back into Canada, and he was residing in the Six Nations. So he ended up living just outside of Niagara Falls, New York. And even after his passing, and even to this day, Canada will not let his remains come back to Canada. So most people don't know the story, but it's factual. So about 45 years ago, the Confederacy came up with two things. One was the what we call a red card, and that's our citizenship card, and we utilize that to travel to the United States. It identifies us, what our, in this case, our Oneida name is, and that we're the part of the Oneida Nation, and so the United States will accept it. Sometimes there's some problems at the border, but but you ultimately get through. When you come back to Canada, you attempt to utilize that the red card. Canada takes a position as a fantasy document, and they'll either deny you entry until you can produce some other kind of proof, or sometimes they'll grudgingly let you come in. Our passports were first developed around that same time, and people started utilizing them to travel to different countries in the world. And again, it depends on the current leadership perspective of that particular country, of whether they allow it or not. But again, up to 45 countries have accepted it. So in my time, more recent years, well, that's actually quite a few years now, we've had meetings with the State Department in Washington, D.C. We've met with Homeland Security. We've met with senior officials inside of the bureaucracy, not just bureaucracy, but politicians in Ottawa. And we've been pushing the point. Most recently, we were in Ottawa this past February. We were meeting with respect to our passports and our red cards. And the minister we meeting with said, well, what we should do is we should appoint a special representative to examine the relationship between Indigenous Haudenosaunee and Canada. So I said, well, that's good, but is this still a report that gathers dust on a shelf? And there was not much of a response following that. And then subsequent to that, COVID breaks out, and we haven't had the opportunity to actually pursue that line with the minister. We did. You didn't ask me about this, but we did put together a paper and rejected Canada's framework legislation that was promoted by the first Trudeau government. This current Trudeau, his first go around, and we rejected that, and we sent a copy of the paper to both the Governor General and to the Prime Minister. And we were scheduled to make a presentation to the Standing Committee, and the election came along, and so that held it off. And then we were going to make a presentation to the Standing Committee this past spring, and of course COVID happened, so that's held in abeyance as well. So we tend to be very strong in our position relative to Truro, and you had asked me to mention, I can talk a little bit about Oneida. So our homelands are in New York State. So up until the American Revolution, we would travel, not just our Oneida Nation, but all the other Iroquois nations would travel to different parts of North America, including the beaver hunting grounds, as we call it, this was on Spoon, Southern Ontario. So it wasn't that it was unknown for us to be here. In fact, we sent a group of people over here in about 1635. It's a little off track, but it's kind of related. So a friend of mine, we were talking about this COVID situation, and he said, it's not unlike what happened in the 1600s. Our people were devastated by the diseases that the Europeans brought with them. We had no immunity to it. We lost lots and lots and lots of people. And he says, interesting, now you had this COVID breakout and our outbreak, and same thing is occurring. There's no immunity, and people are dying. And we're losing a lot of folks. And he just said, it's interesting. So what happened in 1635? We send some people over, and they encourage, and I'm not sure how strong a word the courage was, but they encouraged people to go back with them. And they repopulated our nation in the homelands. And in fact, it happened in all of our Iroquois communities. So in about 1750, 40 or whatever, it was expected that there was going to be some kind of detention was going to lead to some kind of a breakout of hostilities between the Americans, what now became what they were called colonists at the time, and the British Empire. And so we were subsequently we were being courted by the Methodist missionaries representing both parties to join on their side. And when these hostilities broke out. So initially, the Haudenosaunee took a position of neutrality. However, what happens is that Joseph Brant was, as I understand, was a great orator, and he was fluent in the language, and I think his father was English. He spent a fair amount of time in England. He came back, and he had that charisma, and he was able to convince 4 out of the 6 nations to fight, most of them fight on the British side, and the 2 others, the Oneidas and Tuscaroras, decided to fight on the American side on behalf of the colonists. And there was also a group of Oneidas that remained neutral. So we all know the results of what happened in the Revolution. The British were defeated. They moved to, they were now in control of Canada. They moved back into Canada, and there was a treaty entered into with the United States government, 1794, the Canandaigua Treaty. And even though we're not talking about the United States treaty, this treaty was made with the U.S. government, and essentially said that the Oneidas and Tuscaroras would be guaranteed in their land forever. That was in 1794. 1794, we had entered into various treaties with principally New York State, and we went down from about 7-8 million acres of land in about 1778. By 1794, we were down to about 270,000 acres. By 1846, we were down to 0. So, so the 1794 treaty guaranteeing us land forever was a figment of somebody's imagination. So there were people that in 1820, Oneida people that moved to what's now Oneida, Wisconsin, just outside of Green Bay. And in 1838, there was, as a result of the impetus by the federal government of the United States to move all the indigenous people west of the Mississippi, there was a concerted effort to move the indigenous people, particularly the Haudenosaunee, who were remaining in New York State. And another way to look at it is, prior to the arrival of the European, all indigenous nations had their own economies. They had their own methodologies of sustaining life, and whether it be hunting, fishing, gathering, whatever. And they also had trading. Well, on top of that, and I'm not saying that other nations didn't have it, I just don't know that they do. On top of that, Haudenosaunee people, in this case Oneidas, we were farmers. And so we cultivated our land, and our biggest crop was something called white corn, and we had orchards and so on. So we had our own method we had our own way of our own economy, our way of life, and it was self-sufficient. It was dependent on being able to access the natural world, Mother Earth. So as we're losing our land, as we're shrinking our land, and as we're being, quite frankly, being put down hard by the New York State and the American government, our people sent 5 of our loyani, 5 of our chiefs, to meet with Crown officials, and in 1838, and the chiefs did a presentation to the Crown officials, and some very nice words were spoken. And one of the things they said was that they didn't shed a drop of British blood, And they were wondering, and I'm paraphrasing, but they were wondering if they were to move to this part of the Turtle Island, how would the British view them? So the words that were given back were, they said, well, we recognize you as old and faithful allies. And so you have to look at where does old and faithful allies come from? And it comes from the treaty relationships that we made with the Crown, and that included the Turo. So, and that, again, the Turo, connotates that we have a separate way of life, and they're not going to interfere with us. So they visited in 1838, visited in 1839, and July 14th of 1840, there was an order in council passed. And I don't know if the students are on this line here know about the Privy Council, but if you don't, you should look it up. And I'll just give you a short version of it. Privy Council is a British parliamentary tradition, and I shouldn't say ever since, but at the very beginning, when the monarchy was reduced in power and they established a parliamentary system in England, they established Privy Council. So Privy Council usually consists, it always consists of Prime Minister, at least 2 senior cabinet ministers, and usually 2 rich white guys. And I say that, emphasize white guys. And so what they do is they have the ability to pass something called the Order in Council. That Order in Council is equivalent to any piece of legislation that goes through any parliament. So normally, like today in Canada, a minister will introduce a bill and it goes through first reading, it goes to a committee, and there's some constant questions and comments and stuff like that, or maybe some changes. It goes through a second reading, same kind of process. It goes through a third reading. It's passed by the Parliament, and then it goes to the Senate. And the Senate does their thing, and then they eventually bless it. And at some point, it's handed to the Governor General to sign off, and then it becomes law. Well, the Privy Council has that same authority by Order in Council. Today, orders in councils tend to be used mostly for appointments to boards and other kinds of federal ministries and so on. So, but in 1840, the Order in Council, the Privy Council passed an order, and it said essentially, in so many words, the Oneidas were civilized enough to handle their own affairs, and so we won't interfere with it. We won't interfere with them, and we will. The only time we'll get involved is they ask for help. We'll provide countenance in a context of advice, and otherwise, hope they make out really well. So, as an example of that, as far as I'm aware, we're the only community in Canada, Indigenous community, that probates our own wills. We don't have any surveys done by outside surveyors. We don't share our information with any of the affairs, and we take care of all our land transactions internally. Our land is held in common. So, there's definite uniqueness in terms of Oneida's land holding in it. Another way to look at it is if post War of 1812, looking at Southern Ontario, somewhere around 1815, Canada starts a survey of on land in Southern Ontario. So there were different allocation methods that were employed to give primarily to British Army officers, or if you knew people, if you were the gentry, you got land. And eventually, what happened is, as these land holdings were doled out, you were required to pay tax on your land. And so that was the basis of how that system worked. Well, when we came here in 1840, we started acquiring land. We brought money with us from New York State. In the process that was utilized, we identified the parcels of land that we wanted to secure. And so we had our money in trust. It was held in trust by the British Crown in Kingston. They would extract the amount of funds available are required to pay for that land. They would arrange to get the title deeds, and the title deeds were supposed to be given to our chiefs. And we also indicated that we wanted the Crown to protect the title of land, not to make it Crown land. It's not Crown land. It's very important to understand the distinction, but that they would protect our title. And it took them about 50 years before they finally started giving us our title. We had to ask repeatedly. So and the other thing that the Crown guaranteed and was confirmed in a treaty-like document in 1850 was that any land at Oneida acquired would be free from taxation. So yeah, that's a little story on Oneida landers. There's more to it, but that's enough.
Yeah, I always I have very limited knowledge of that story, and I always am like very, very, like Oneida has such a unique situation in that it's a settlement, like it's not under the Indian Act, like those kinds of things. So and I think it's really important for people to know that. So thank you for sharing, because it even, like I said, I have very limited knowledge of that story, and you filled in some gaps. So thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and earlier you kind of mentioned like elected council, like chief and council through the Indian Act, and I am thinking about 1492 Land Back Lane and the Haldeman deed, and kind of these differences between traditional governance and elected governance, and kind of the situation going on there. So I was just wondering if you wanted to share any insights or what you might know about that specific situation that's unfolding.
Yeah, I can tell you. I can tell you a little. I want to call it a story, but it's but it's the truth. So in 1846, there was a change in who was determining policy relative to Indigenous people, and up until that point in time, the Crown officials that determined policy towards Indigenous people was the Department of War, and you have to think and understand in the context that War of 1812 was still a recent memory. And the Indigenous people, Tecumseh, under his leadership in the west towards Windsor, where he played a really dominant role in repelling the Americans. And likewise, the people at Six Nations New Credit played a dominant role in repelling the colonists in the Fort Erie area. Well, as that threat started to dissipate, the Department of War pulled back, and they handed this off to another agency. And my sub-chief told me who it was, but I don't recall. But anyway, they had this discussion about what should we do with these Indigenous people? We have to do something with them. And so they ended up deciding that they were going to civilize us. They were going to Christianize us. So they passed an act, I think it was 1854, and it was called the Gradual Civilization Act. And the intent was to get us to a point where we felt that we were equal enough to be, I guess, white, that we could renounce our indigenous, and we could become crown subjects. And I think it was 1858, they passed their first piece of legislation that started to control Indigenous lands. And by the way, one of the first residential school that was opened up in 1832. It was in the Mush Hole, they call it, in Brantford. And of course, the residential school story is probably well known by most people, but it was designed to remove children from their kids, our children from their mother and father. Because who did you get your teachers from? Who did you teach you how to speak your language, or who taught you your ways, your way of life, and so on, your belief systems? It was your family, principally your mom. So the intent of the residential school was to remove that impediment, as they saw it, to let's get these kids as white as we can, as quick as we can. And so 1858, they passed legislation that's designed to could start controlling Indigenous land. In 1874, I believe, they passed the first Indian Act, which was intended to control all Indigenous lives. And I think it was 1878, 1884. I can't remember exactly the year now. They introduced the concept that it was time to take out these Indigenous governance structures, and we had to replace them with municipal style governance. So they started doing that. They started pursuing that, and so I know the history of the Haudenosaunee better than I do other nations. So in 1920, for example, you had the Mohawk community of Akwesasne, near Cornwall. They had their traditional form of government. They sent the RCMP in to install the elective system, and people resisted. So the RCMP killed a couple guys and were successful in implementing the system, the elective system. In 1924, at Six Nations, the RCMP went in and surrounded the council hall where the chiefs used to meet and wouldn't let the chiefs meet and any kind of governance way and install the elective system. And in 1934, there was a bit less resistance at Oneida, and the elective system was installed at Oneida over the protest of folks. And I've heard stories told to me that the Indian agent had tried several times to introduce the elective system to Oneida, and each time he was rejected. So he's trying it again. And notice goes out in the community that they're having a meeting, and a lot of people said, well, I'm not going, we already turned that down. But some people went, and so they're doing the presentation. At some point, the Indian agent literally drew a line in the sand, and he said, those that want an elective system cross this line. So the number I hear was either 7 or 11 passed the line, and the rest were non-existent or left. And the Indian agent declared that the Indian Act was now going to apply into an Oneida. So a little known story that was that there was a lot of concern, put it that way, very large concern. And there was some thoughts that maybe there needs to be a way to deal with these guys that brought the elective system. And I'll just leave it at that, leave it up to people's imagination what that really means. But they were dissuaded from taking that course of action simply because they said that's not the way we do things. That we don't do that to people. So they said that the elective system was probably going to disappear anyway. It was destined to not last. But it actually started to pick up a little bit of legs after World War II, and started to really start developing a little bit of more currency, if you will, in the 60s and 70s. And I would tell you this because it's true. I was elected chief from 1982 to 1994, one 2-year period of interruption. And so I know the system well. And I've done presentations as deputy minister. I've done analysis of their policies and so on, things like that. I became a thorn in their side, either during that time when I was in office or post office. And in 1987, at a general meeting that we were hosting of our people, I stood up in front of the people. I was chairing the meeting. There was about 300 or 400 people there, and I said, my goal was to eliminate the elective system. I thought that was a assimilation tool, and we should get rid of it. And either my message wasn't really clear, or I'm not sure, but I got elected 4 more times after that. But I still see the elective system as an assimilation tool. Interesting enough, we're actually having a meeting. The traditional council is meeting the elected council this Friday, and we're going to try and sort out how can we get along. Can we work mutually on some issues that are confronting our community? Because ultimately, in the end, I believe all Indigenous nations look at it this way. We need to do the best for our future generations. We need to make sure that when our future generations, those ones that aren't, their faces, you haven't seen them yet, it's called 7 generations. We need to make sure that they have it better than what we have. And so it's in our best interest as a community, as this portion of the Oneida Nation, to find a way to get along together so that we don't allow external forces, external viewpoints on things to influence our thinking. And I'll just leave it this way. Here's another to think about. Why does the mainstream society think we want to be them? Why do they think that? Why do they think we want to be them? We don't want to be them. We have to coexist. We have to live. And you look at it, the basis of Turo, yeah, we got to live on a side by side, but we don't want to be you. And I remember saying that to a couple of non-Indigenous folks I know, and it took them by surprise. But then they agree with me. So that's something for your students to think about. Don't try to make us you. Respect us for who we are, and that applies to all Indigenous people.
It's an awesome note to leave it on. Because we are basically at time, I guess. At this point in time, was there anything that you would like to add? Something I should have asked you but didn't. Something you want people to walk away with?
Gee, I don't know. I think it just comes down to is, in the end, we're all humans, and we all are dependent on Mother Earth. We're dependent on Mother Earth providing for us and supporting us. And they might call it the green movement or whatever you want to call it. But the fact is, the industrialized society that we're all part of is we're killing Mother Earth, and we have to stop it. We have to find a way to nurture her and give thanks. So that's what I'd say. Maybe is we need to remember to give thanks to all things in creation. And in our ways, we believe everything has a spirit, whether it's a tree or whether it's the bird I'm looking outside my window here, or whether it's a rock or the water. It's been proven that water has a spirit. It's scientifically proven. So I think that's the important thing is to take away from this is that we're all humans, and as humans, we need to find a way to get along with each other.
Definitely. Y'all go, Al. This was such a pleasure to have you share your knowledge with all of us, and basically everyone listening. We do have one more event on Friday. We'll be speaking with Ramona Salt and Leslie Whiteeye of Chippewa of the Thames First Nation about the Big Bear Creek settlement and that land claim. I hope you've been enjoying our social media content. And this recording will be available hopefully next week. We just have some uploading issues for our website, but this recording Mondays and Fridays will be available hopefully next week on the Office of Indigenous Initiatives website. So thank you everyone for coming today. And unless you have anything else to say, Al, I think that concludes our afternoon together. Thank you again so much.
Yeah, y'all go.
Y'all go.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to be abrupt and end the meeting for everyone. So thank you so much again, everyone.